Elizabeth I is possibly the most famous English queen in history, despite having reigned over 400 years ago. But Elizabeth's life still raises questions, and one of the most prominent is why she never married. Let's look at her early life and find some possible answers to that question. Elizabeth's early life was surprisingly difficult for someone born a princess. Born on the 7th of September 1533 at Greenwich Palace, she was the daughter of King Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. This itself had caused controversy before Elizabeth was even born. Henry had put his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, to one side, and his daughter from that marriage, Princess Mary, was no longer heir to the throne. This separation would coincide with a break from the Catholic Church, but Henry's main reason for taking another wife was due to wanting a son as his royal heir. Therefore, when Elizabeth was born, she was the heir presumptive to the English throne, and she was treated with the opulence and honour expected of her station. Despite not being a boy, Henry publicly was delighted with his new daughter, although privately he was disappointed. The notices announcing the birth of the royal child had to have an S added onto the word prince, as it had been assumed and predicted a prince would be born, not a princess. At 3 months old, Elizabeth was given her own household at Hatfield House, but she still had regular visits from her mother Anne, who also ensured she was given the best and most expensive of everything, showering her daughter with as much love as she was able. However, Henry was already growing tired of Anne just a few months after, and after a few more miscarriages and stillbirths that came to nothing, he was flirting with one of his queen consort's ladies-in-waiting, Jane Seymour. Anne had made it very obvious she was not going to leave her position any more quietly than Catherine of Aragon had, and Henry wanted rid of her. Charges were trumped up against her that she had committed adultery with not only members of her household and other nobles, but also with her own brother. Historians today agree almost unanimously that these charges were very likely completely made up in order to remove Anne, but unfortunately she was found guilty. Anne was beheaded on the 19th of May 1536 when Elizabeth was just a few months shy of being 3 years old. Despite not actively having had anything to do with her parents' relationship, it would have a dramatic effect on Elizabeth's life. Like her half-sister Mary, she was now declared illegitimate and removed from the royal succession, as her father married Jane Seymour just a few days after Anne's death. It's uncertain when exactly Elizabeth was told about what had happened. She was a very clever child, and she asked her governess one day why, instead of calling her Lady Princess as everyone had before, they were now addressing her as Lady Elizabeth. It must have been an awkward and emotional conversation. And although Henry was emotionally distant, he ensured Elizabeth received a Renaissance education, and she was quick to pick up several languages and could converse on a seemingly endless number of intellectual subjects. Her governess, appointed in 1537, Catherine "Cat" Ashley, would not only become the princess's friend until her death, but taught her many of the foreign languages she came to know. Over the years, Elizabeth would have several renowned tutors, from William Grindal, who taught her Latin, French and Greek, and Roger Ascham, who would also teach Elizabeth philosophy, classics and elements of the Protestant faith. Elizabeth was also skilled with several instruments and loved walking outdoors, hunting and dancing. Her father would then marry Anne of Cleves in a short-lived marriage, but she was a kind stepmother to all 3 children. Then would come Henry's disastrous marriage to the tragic and young Catherine Howard, who would end up meeting the same fate as Anne Boleyn in February 1542. At just 8 years old, Elizabeth had got on well with her youthful and kind third stepmother, and Catherine Howard's death hit her hard, probably not least because of the echoes of what had happened to her own mother. She apparently said, "I shall never marry." At this point, it's not surprising such a young girl had this view. In her mind, marriage was inextricably tied with death, whether that was intentionally through a tyrant king or unintentionally through the dangers of childbirth. Henry's final wife, Catherine Parr, would also do her utmost to repair the relationship between the king and his daughters. He had barely looked at Elizabeth as she reminded him too much of Anne Boleyn, but Parr was taken with the sweet and intelligent child the princess had become, and she helped soften Henry towards her. It was also Catherine Parr who helped oversee the education of Elizabeth, and her influence would only have encouraged the punishing educational schedule the princess was put under, but Elizabeth thrived in it. She also got on well with her new stepmother, and made her a gift of a translation of a poem by Marguerite of Navarre, Miroir de l'âme pécheresse, or Mirror of the Sinful Soul, at New Year's in 1544 when Elizabeth was just 11. After Henry's death in January 1547, Elizabeth went to stay with her former stepmother Catherine, bored of the newly elaborate rituals at court. It was something that would stain her reputation and remain as a question mark over her entire life, and weirdly also brings us to suitor number 1, Thomas Seymour. Catherine had, against the wishes of the Regency Council, married Thomas Seymour, Baron Seymour of Sudeley, just 4 months after the king's death. Unknown to Catherine, Thomas had actually already pressed his suit to the extremely young Elizabeth just shortly before proposing to Catherine. Elizabeth had turned him down, but at the age of 14, the young princess was an impressionable and naive teenager, and it seems Seymour had designs on her regardless. While Elizabeth stayed with Catherine at the old manor in Chelsea, Thomas would often come into the princess's bedroom wearing only his nightgown and slippers, and would only stay in the room if she was still in bed. It was behaviour that horrified Cat Ashley, but Catherine, happy with her first ever pregnancy, brushed it off as innocent fun since she still saw Elizabeth as merely a child and perhaps wanted to put her head in the sand a bit about her husband. Thomas would openly romp with Elizabeth in front of the household servants, tickling her and slapping her on the buttocks. At times, Catherine even joined in, showing how suitably gaslit she was by her attractive but manipulative husband. We cannot apply modern thinking to a historical situation that we have patchy details for, but it still feels very uncomfortable. While Elizabeth appears to have had something of a crush on Seymour to start with, she also at times appeared uncomfortable, rising early with plenty of maids in her room to ensure she was up and dressed before he arrived. Eventually, Catherine came across Elizabeth and Thomas in each other's arms, and she connected the dots. It would appear Catherine had attempted to join in with her husband's actions in order to perhaps curtail him, or even to make them appear more innocent as she was joining in. Whatever the case, in May 1548, Elizabeth was sent away to Sir Anthony Denny's household at Cheshunt. She would maintain contact with Catherine Parr until her former stepmother's death through letters. Elizabeth wrote a remorseful letter to Catherine for what had happened, although whatever did happen could not be considered the fault of a 14-year-old in any era. When Catherine died on the 5th of September that year, Thomas had a few months of genuine grief before he decided to have another go at marrying the princess. He once again sent an offer of marriage to Elizabeth, and she turned him down flat. Some historians have suggested Cat Ashley liked Seymour and encouraged Elizabeth to go for it, but that seems highly unlikely given her shock at his earlier behaviour. The Princess Elizabeth was shaken up by the events at Chelsea, and this was compounded by events in January 1549. Thomas Seymour had attempted to enter the young King Edward's apartments and kidnap him, and the sordid details of his behaviour with Elizabeth came out. Then living at Hatfield once again, Elizabeth was interrogated by Sir Robert Tyrwhitt, who was convinced of her guilt. Elizabeth was cool and logical with Tyrwhitt, admitting nothing, especially as there was no evidence of her having conspired with Thomas Seymour, and eventually she and her household were free from suspicion. Seymour was found guilty of treason and beheaded on the 20th of March. But the whole affair had left a bad taste in Elizabeth's mouth about men, and when connected to her fear of marriage, was likely a large factor in her later decision to remain unmarried. On the 17th of November 1558, Elizabeth went from being third in line to becoming Elizabeth I, Queen of England. At this point, regardless of how she may have personally felt about marriage, she would have been expected to get herself a husband, if only to produce heirs for England's throne. But it was a complex matter, as it had been for her sister, Mary. Any husband of the Queen's could possibly make a fuss about not actually ruling the country themselves, or they could find England swallowed up into another empire in the making, taking away its independence. Ideally, the future husband also had to be Protestant, although this itself was complex and not set in stone. While Elizabeth certainly leaned towards Protestantism, she certainly wasn't militant about it the way her brother Edward had been, and she liked a lot of Catholic trappings in ceremonies. She made it clear from the start with her famous quote that she had no desire to make windows into men's souls, that she was happy to allow both faiths to exist if everyone behaved themselves. This was different from Mary, who had been Catholic and went for a Catholic husband, who funnily enough was Elizabeth's first suitor during her reign. Enter suitor number 2, brother-in-law to potential fiancé, Philip II of Spain. Philip's marriage to Mary had resulted in no children, and it was little surprise considering in their marriage of less than 5 years, they had only spent about 6 months together. But why look across Europe for another wife when you can just look across the palace room? From a political point of view, it made sense to maintain the connection with England for Spain because it kept a European balance of power. But in reality, he had already been spotted by some courtiers apparently flirting with Elizabeth even before Mary's death. But for Elizabeth, she had never flirted back, and she still didn't entertain any desire to marry her former brother-in-law. Aside from the entire argument her father had created over marrying your dead sibling's spouse with his brother Arthur and Catherine of Aragon, which was a load of nonsense in itself, there was a whole host of other reasons Elizabeth didn't want to accept the proposal. The first was that she had seen firsthand how unpopular the marriage had been with the English people. This was partly because they were worried about England being merged into the Habsburg Empire one day, and partly because, well, the population at that time tended to be somewhat xenophobic and didn't want a foreign king from a Catholic country. And the fact Philip was Catholic was itself a sticking point. Even if Elizabeth ignored this fact, there might always be pressure that she should convert, and Elizabeth was also well aware of the connection her people made between Mary and Philip and the unpopular mass burnings at the stake for supposed Protestant heretics in years gone by. Another reason was that Elizabeth needed someone who would support her in running her kingdom. Philip was very wrapped up in Spain and his other lands, to the point he had hardly been by Mary's side during her reign. It would also cause a conflict if England went to war with another kingdom that wasn't at war with Spain, something that had been a problem for Mary as well when Philip had insisted English soldiers were needed in a Spanish war. All in all, Elizabeth didn't want to marry Philip, but she also didn't want to cause him offence. So she did the only sensible thing possible and didn't give him an answer. Eventually, Philip would grow tired of waiting for her and ended up marrying Elizabeth of Valois instead in 1559, a year later. However, it didn't actually sour the relationship between Elizabeth and Philip at first. He defended Elizabeth when the Pope would threaten her with excommunication, and a peace was at first maintained between the two kingdoms. It was only years later, after Elizabeth had sided with the Dutch Protestants rebelling from the Habsburg Empire, and when she had encouraged English privateers to attack Spanish ships, especially those coming from the New World, that this put an end to that peace. But before that, Elizabeth still had plenty of other potential husbands to come, and one of the most famous would be her favourite, suitor number 3, Robert Dudley, 1st Earl of Leicester. Robert Dudley was an older brother of Guildford Dudley, the husband of Lady Jane Grey. Robert himself had been put in the Tower for his part in the whole affair, and Guildford, along with their father John Dudley, 1st Duke of Northumberland, had been executed. Robert had also nearly been beheaded, but narrowly escaped due to his mother and brother-in-law Henry Sidney cozying up to the Spanish courtiers that came with Philip II. Robert was also already married to Amy Robsart, having wed in 1550, a relationship that appears to have begun genuinely as a love match. However, very early on, Elizabeth made it clear that while she wanted to have Robert around as her favourite, she wasn't going to extend the same hospitality to Amy. When Elizabeth became queen, she also made Robert Master of the Horse. This was a role of great responsibility, and he was a good fit as he was an excellent horseman and had a great interest in the transport and breeding of the Queen's stable. However, it was also a role which allowed him to touch the royal person, helping Elizabeth on and off her horse. By April 1559, he had also been made a Knight of the Garter, and they would often go riding together, alone. He was also Elizabeth's type. He was lean and muscular, liked being outdoors and riding, and showed off his body in fashionable clothing. Robert was very tall at 6 foot, good-looking, and had dark hair with a reddish hue to it. Just like the Queen, he had a skill for languages, loved music and dancing, and loved learning in general. It was obvious to anyone with eyes that Elizabeth was in love with him. She spent most evenings with him, the pair laughing and talking together, playing music to each other. While it's highly likely Elizabeth simply saw a way to have male companionship without the mess of actually marrying him, it didn't stop people noticing and thinking the worst. Obviously, the rumour mill started, and it had plenty to feed on. Other courtiers grumbled at how much free time he got with the Queen, and also at how casual he was with her. Some worried that his family ambitions would return. Others still murmured that the Queen had taken him as a lover and was even pregnant with his child. When news got around that Amy was ill with a malady in her breast, things intensified. There were whispers that once the poor woman was dead, Elizabeth and Robert would marry. It must have been heartbreaking for Amy to hear these rumours, and she spent most of her time away from court. Due to her family's ancestral home being in a state of disrepair, she lived mostly with friends in different parts of the country, and by September of 1560, Amy was living at Cumnor Place near Oxford. On the 8th of September, a Sunday, Amy sent her household staff away to a fair being held at Abingdon nearby. She seemed to be in an agitated state of mind, not quite herself, and remained at the house all alone. When everyone returned, she was found dead at the foot of a flight of stairs, apparently having broken her neck. Robert was at Windsor with Elizabeth when he found out the news on the 9th of September, and he immediately called for an inquest. The first worry was that it might have been suicide, although no one believed Amy, as religious as everyone else of her time, would have committed what was considered a mortal sin. The inquest found that it was death by misadventure, or rather that Amy had fallen down the stairs accidentally, causing 2 head injuries and breaking her neck, which caused her death. Robert paid for an elaborate funeral for her and didn't return to court for several months while he was in mourning. However, it wasn't long before malicious talk started around Robert and Amy's death. Some of it supposedly started by Elizabeth's chief advisor, William Cecil, and the English ambassador to France, Nicholas Throckmorton. It's almost certain neither really believed Robert had committed murder, but it was a useful way to keep him from ever becoming king consort. Some people now whispered that Amy's death had been planned by Robert and Elizabeth, that they had poisoned her for months beforehand, or even that Dudley had got his gentleman retainer Sir Richard Verney to do the deed. Today, the most likely explanation is that Amy's malady in her breast was probably breast cancer, and this could possibly have weakened her spine with metastatic cancerous deposits, leading to even a short fall easily snapping the poor woman's neck. And while at the time Elizabeth tried to ignore the whispers and never suspected the man she loved of murder, she recognised that if she married Dudley, her international reputation would be in tatters forever. Even at home, there were rumours of the nobility rising up if Robert became her consort. They would remain friends throughout their lives, but nothing more. And besides that, Elizabeth already had other foreign suitors to contend with, although she was getting good at the game of making everyone guess what she was going to do. This would be displayed perfectly with suitor number 4, Charles II, Archduke of Austria. Charles was a member of the Habsburgs, but from the Austrian line. At the time, they weren't getting on well with the Spanish side of their family, and so had Elizabeth married him, it would have created some conflict for England. But there were some good factors in Charles's stead. He didn't actually have a principality of his own in 1559 when the offers of marriage began, and so his ambassadors argued he would be able to therefore move permanently to England and aid Elizabeth in running her state administration and parliament. Marrying Charles would also link England to the mighty Habsburg Empire, securing it against Spanish threats. The only teeny tiny, mostly insignificant thing they wanted in return was Elizabeth's conversion to the Catholic faith and giving up her independence. She probably couldn't think of anything worse. Baron Caspar Breuner, ambassador for the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand I, reported back that although Elizabeth didn't seem keen on the marriage, she was also being extraordinarily kind to Breuner himself. She kept him close, inviting him aboard her barge and to dinners, chatting merrily and asking questions about Charles. The Queen was well aware that the confusion would mean she could keep stringing everyone along while still keeping them happy to stay. And alongside Charles was another prospective husband, one that had actually been suggested before Elizabeth even became queen. Suitor number 5, Erik XIV of Sweden. Erik had made his suit very plain, even rudely so, by demanding an answer to his proposal before she was even crowned. Ever graceful in response, Elizabeth simply replied that he should offer marriage once she was actually queen. He did so, sending her a gift of expensive tapestries and cloth. On top of this, despite the pair never actually having seen one another, Erik sent passionate love letters to Elizabeth, which was a great source of entertainment for her. After all, who doesn't like having their praises sung? An alliance with the Swedish king seemed perfect on the surface. He was Protestant, and England and Sweden had maintained friendly relations for many years. A trade alliance between the two countries would also be very useful. However, Elizabeth, for all her clever traits, was still a woman who had been brainwashed by her heartless father, and she was nervous of portraits after knowing her father's irritation at Anne of Cleves' images. She didn't trust the pictures she was sent, but when she was given Erik's portrait, she publicly complimented it. The Swedish king had been pretty pleased with it as well. It's often said that this was the reason Elizabeth then turned him down, but in fact that came after he suggested coming in person to visit her. Elizabeth had already noted that a marriage between them would mean Erik had to come and live in England, something which realistically would never happen. It was obvious her subtle hints at "no thank you" hadn't worked, and so she sent Erik a mildly passive-aggressive letter thanking him for the proposal, but saying she had no romantic feelings for him. And so the answer to the proposal was a clear no in February 1559. It turned out to be a wise choice, as the Swedish king was mentally unstable, and years later, after marrying his mistress, Karin Månsdottir, Erik then murdered several courtiers he suspected of conspiring against him. As for Charles II, Elizabeth initially turned him down in the same year, but her warmth towards the ambassador gave the Habsburgs hope, and they pushed once again with an offer of marriage in 1564. But again, Elizabeth gave maddening answers when Charles's emissaries pushed her for one. She replied that she couldn't commit to marrying while she hadn't seen someone face to face. But equally, she didn't want Charles to visit England either, as otherwise she might feel pressured to say yes to marrying him. The new ambassador for Charles, Alvaro de la Quadra, was told by Elizabeth that it was unseemly for a queen and maiden to invite someone to be her husband, and therefore the Archduke should do as he saw fit without involving her. But equally, she continued to ask questions about Charles, such as what languages he spoke and what interests he had. The negotiations dragged on for another 4 years, although at many times Elizabeth gave hope by seeming to once again consider the match seriously, before throwing something in the way which meant she couldn't marry Charles. His father also insisted that if they married and Elizabeth died, he wanted Charles to succeed her if they had no children. By 1568, the Queen was now 35 and her chances of having a child were looking slim, especially as she continued to maintain that she wished to be celibate with no husband. Eventually, the negotiations would come to a standstill as Elizabeth decided the religious question between them was just too difficult to overcome. A few years later, in 1571, Charles instead married Maria Anna of Bavaria for his first wife, who in true Habsburg style also happened to be his niece. Now of an age where most women would be winding down child-rearing and were considered middle-aged, Elizabeth had less offers for her hand, but was still considered a glittering prize. She was, after all, a queen over a strong, mostly Protestant, financially stable kingdom, and having an heir wasn't impossible either. Anyone who did marry her, even without an heir, might be able to take her throne afterwards and remarry. In the 1570s, Elizabeth began to consider a French match. Years before, wanting to prevent the alliance between England and Austria, Catherine de' Medici had sent a short-lived offer of marriage from her son, Charles IX of France. At the time, the French king was only 14 years old to Elizabeth's 31 years, and the idea of marrying him gave the English queen obvious ick. However, in later years, she would consider a marriage to Henry, Duke of Anjou, who would later become Henry III of France in 1570. However, due to the fact he was Catholic and 18 years her junior, it's likely Elizabeth never really considered this proposal with any seriousness. It was meant purely to stir up concern from Spain. However, Elizabeth would end up taking an offer from Henry's younger brother slightly more seriously. Enter suitor number 6, Francis, Duke of Anjou, in 1572. At the time, Francis was not what we might delicately call Elizabeth's type. The poor young man had caught smallpox while still a child, as Elizabeth herself had as a young woman, but unlike Elizabeth, it had left Francis with pitting and scars on his face. He also apparently had a deformed spine, and reports of his looks were not favourable, but his mother Catherine declared that his beard, just coming in at 17 years old, would cover the worst of the scarring, and an alliance between France and England would have been a powerful buffer against Spain for both of them. On top of this, Francis was considered to otherwise be healthy and strong, and his conviction to Catholicism was far flimsier than his brother's. Elizabeth was by now nearly 40. The large age gap between herself and Francis was what worried her the most, although she also wondered if she might be able to use the matter of his disfiguring smallpox marks to have Calais thrown into a marriage alliance. But the small matter of Charles IX deciding to kill off his Huguenot subjects in August 1572 in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre put a halt to proceedings, with Elizabeth quite understandably saying she would never consider a French match while their Protestant subjects were being targeted. It wasn't until July 1573 that Charles announced his subjects should be free to follow religion as they saw fit, and negotiations resumed. Finally, in March 1574, it was agreed that Francis would come to visit Elizabeth in England, something that had not been extended to any other suitor. While everyone was fully aware that this marriage would not be as easy as one in her youth might have been due to the age gap, and the fact it was highly likely no children would come of it, Elizabeth's advisors still hoped this might be the one. However, the meeting didn't happen. Francis was implicated in an intrigue against his brother Henry, who had become king in May 1574 and had been placed under house arrest. Francis escaped and joined forces with Henry I, Prince of Condé, and Henry, King of Navarre, and their combined strength was enough to convince his brother Henry III to sign the Edict of Beaulieu on the 6th of May 1576. Not only did this edict allow Huguenots the right of public worship for their religion, but it also gave secret treaties to those who had forced Henry's hand. Francis gained the Duchy of Anjou along with other lands, becoming the Duke of Anjou. As his brother Henry also remained childless, Francis was now also next in line for the French throne. His new position went to his head a little, and he began to place himself as a protector of French Protestants, positioning himself as a potential leader for the Dutch people as well. Elizabeth did not want Francis meddling in Dutch affairs, and she realised one way to keep him from that would be to possibly reopen the negotiations for marriage. Equally, it was an attractive prospect for Francis, politically at least. The English Queen may now have been wearing wigs and thick makeup, but she was still a powerful ruler with a financially strong country. At the French court, Francis was considered a nuisance, and he still yearned for a crown of his own. It seemed a good solution, and he made the first move in around 1578 by sending a letter declaring his devotion to Elizabeth. The Queen would be moved to chase what would be her final courtship for other reasons as well. Robert Dudley was still kept constantly close to Elizabeth's side as her friend and advisor, but that hadn't stopped him from pursuing romantic affairs, and he had at least one illegitimate son by 1574. But sometime around 1573 he had taken up with another lover, Lettice Knowles. She was a cousin once removed of Elizabeth herself, and at the time was married to Walter Devereux, 1st Earl of Essex. They had previously flirted many years before in the summer of 1565, and the Queen's jealousy had been made vehemently known then. Essex went to Ireland in July 1576 and died of dysentery in September. Once again, the ugly head of poisoning and murder accusations reared up, but an inquest found nothing suspicious. On the 21st of September 1578, Lettice and Robert were secretly married, and it would be another 9 months before it was publicly made known to Elizabeth. She was broken-hearted at what she saw as a betrayal, and was angry that her permission for the marriage had not been sought out. Reportedly, she took this out on Lettice when she turned up at court one day, boxing the poor woman's ears. Eventually, she would forgive Robert and allow him to return to court, but she never extended the same courtesy to Lettice. But it was at least a line drawn under their relationship, and Elizabeth had to do away with the fantasy she would ever be able to marry the man she loved. But this allowed her to really consider marrying Francis instead, and negotiations got underway once again. By November 1579, Francis had sent one of his favoured courtiers to England in order to prepare Elizabeth for what he called his frenzied wooing, sending 12,000 crowns worth of jewels as well. She in exchange sent him a portrait miniature of herself, as well as a pair of fine gloves. Elizabeth also kept with her at all times a tiny gem-encrusted book Francis had sent for her. It's not strange that she might have changed her mind on marriage at this point. With the vigour of youth, she had been steadfast in her belief to remain a virgin queen, but as she grew older, it's likely Elizabeth grew lonely for male companionship. She no longer had this with her beloved Earl of Leicester, and the Duke of Anjou's pockmarked face and difference in age suddenly didn't seem as important anymore. But still she was anxious that Francis only wanted her for her crown, and determined they needed to meet in person. But although some of Elizabeth's council were delighted she was finally considering marriage and thought Francis was a good choice, many courtiers were still against the match due to the Duke being French and Catholic. Nevertheless, on the 17th of August 1579, Francis finally arrived at Greenwich to secretly visit the Queen, eager to meet his new potential bride. At sunset, Elizabeth snuck out of the palace with one of her ladies to dine with Francis, and was pleasantly surprised by what she saw. Due to the many rumours and reports of his looks, she had expected a disfigured, misshapen, short man covered in scars on his face, and instead she found an attractive young man with dark hair and sparkling eyes, witty and far more handsome than she had been led to believe. She declared, "I have never in my life seen a creature more agreeable to me." Francis gave her a frog-shaped earring which Elizabeth would wear throughout their courtship, and she nicknamed him her little frog, although it's not clear if this was due to the earring or the unflattering slang nickname sometimes given by the English to French people. Whatever the truth, there was an unmistakable attraction between the odd pair, and Protestants in the country were outraged. Whereas before Francis would probably have willingly changed religion to marry Elizabeth, as the heir to the French throne, he now had to remain a Catholic or risk losing it. He had to leave late in August, and on his departure, Elizabeth penned a short poem titled On Monsieur's Departure, lamenting Francis needing to leave her side. He left his ambassador behind to finalise the marriage. However, Elizabeth's subjects reacted strongly against the match, writing pamphlets condemning the marriage and the Duke, and many of Elizabeth's advisors warned about religious riots breaking out on English soil. The Queen must have sadly realised her marriage to Francis could never really happen, but she had to maintain the illusion of it to keep friendly relations with France. When French emissaries were sent in 1581 to draw up the terms for the marriage, Elizabeth surprised them by stating she might not wish to marry Francis at all, but she still wished to have an alliance of friendship with him. Francis himself was therefore forced in November, running out of resources in the Netherlands, to visit Elizabeth himself once more. The pair once again slipped into behaving as lovers, and the young Duke was even overheard to have said he longed day and night to be allowed into Elizabeth's bed to show her what a fine companion he could be. The Queen even publicly stated in front of witnesses the Duke of Anjou would be her husband, kissing him on the lips and exchanging rings with him as a gesture of her pledge. In front of witnesses, it was as good as a formal betrothal. But just 2 days later, she told Francis that for the sake of her subjects, even though privately she felt differently, she could not marry him. Francis initially accepted this, and in exchange, Elizabeth offered him a loan of £60,000 to lead a Dutch campaign against the Spanish in December. However, at the end of the month, he was still at the English court, determined somehow he would still marry Elizabeth, and he burst into tears when she said he must from that point on think of her only as a sister. Finally, by February 1582, Francis had left, and by then Elizabeth was taken with another of her famous favourites, Sir Walter Raleigh. The Duke of Anjou would be the last of Elizabeth's serious suitors, and from that point on she would insist she was married to her kingdom and her subjects. She had, in the years she remained unmarried, created a cult of personality around herself based on the iconography of the Virgin Queen. This would now be the persona Elizabeth leaned heavily into for the rest of her life, recognising she really would never marry. She would continue to have favourites, but these were never more than flattery and compliments to a renowned but ageing queen, and Elizabeth enjoyed them, but was well aware of what they were. Only 2 men ever came really close to claiming her heart, both at different times of her life. Robert Dudley was her childhood friend and sweetheart, and her love for him was never really broken. After she died, a letter from him was found in her belongings, marked with words in her hand, his last letter. The unfortunate events of his family and the death of his first wife ensured Elizabeth could not marry him, as she, unlike her father, chose her country and subjects over her own desires. And Francis, Duke of Anjou, was an unlikely contender in the contest to marry the English Queen, but it seems the two connected regardless of their difference in age and religion. He seems to have been genuinely heartbroken at her refusal in the end to marry him, and Elizabeth seems to have agonised over the decision in a way that shows she also, at least at some point, really did consider marrying her little frog. It's not difficult to imagine why Elizabeth took the route she did into celibacy and remaining single. As a child, she must have been traumatised by the knowledge of how her mother Anne and her stepmother Catherine Howard both died. The connection of marriage to death coloured her youthful thinking on the subject, and the dangers of the heart were brought sharply home with the tangled events of Thomas Seymour. When she came to the throne of England as a young woman, her intelligence and logic won out over her heart, and Elizabeth calmly rejected offers from Europe, cleverly stringing them along for years. It was only in her later years, recognising the last possible attempt she might become a wife, Elizabeth wavered in her decision to remain unmarried. But remaining the Virgin Queen would ensure the safety of England for decades to come, the unity of Scotland and England by passing her throne to James VI of Scotland, and cementing her legacy as a legend for generations to come. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.